Ah,
Non, le son.
ah non, 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 c'est pas un média, c'est pas une chose comme ça. Ouais,
If you want to tell me, otherwise I'll just.
otherwise, yeah, at the end, I don't think it'll go over, it's max at 45 minutes, right? It's not going to go
No worries.
enough time.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Just. Whenever you're ready. It's up to you.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm going to get started. Not much of a crowd, but I guess it is lunchtime. I'm here to talk about our experiences with security tokens. I know this is not as sexy as a topic right now as flash loans and things like that, but I do think it's an interesting topic, and I would love to share our experiences and to get your insights on it as well. So again, my name is Justin. I'm one of the co-founders at Quigley. I don't know if you guys have heard of us, but we started as a programmable equity platform, basically built on top of building security tokens to use as kind of employee equity. Our major first use case was work for equity. So let me just start by introducing a little bit about myself. Again, I'm one of the co-founders. I'm the CEO at Quigley. I did my university at the University of Maryland. Its tech claim to fame is Sergey Brin graduated from there. He nothing to do with Google at the time, but Maryland will tell everybody that Sergey Brin was a graduate. Good school. I spent some time at KPMG doing M&A advisory, so a lot of accounting, financial due diligence. It was my first experience with securities, dealing a lot with ownership equity of mergers and acquisitions that occur cross-border. Then I spent a couple of years with Rocket Internet. I built 3 ventures with them in Southeast Asia, all in e-commerce. With Rocket, my first venture I launched, fashion e-commerce platform in Vietnam. We had an exit there in Thailand, so that was also my first experience with exiting while owning ownership equity in a company. And I'm currently based in France. I'm here because I came to France to do business school, and been here 7 years. Very lovely environment, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to talk about our experiences with you. So a little bit about Quigley. Like I mentioned, we started as a work for equity platform using tokens at a time when security tokens was not yet something big at the moment. We certainly didn't create security tokens, but at the time when we started, early 2018, it was like the beginning of people trying to build out asset-based tokens. Guys like Polymath had just completed their ICO. Harbor was working on it as well. But before this whole kind of security token concept became more fully realized, we were one of the earlier teams working on that. Today we've been backed by Consensus through their Tachyon Accelerator, as well as D-Lab, which is a joint venture between SOSV, an American VC, as well as Emergo, which is not on Ethereum. I hope you guys will forgive us. They are the commercial arm of Cardano. But again, I can tell you more about our experiences with security tokens and what Quigley has evolved into now throughout the course of my talk. So when we started, as I mentioned, we started as a work for equity platform. And so our thesis that I can kind of review for you is we found work for equity to be a way to really give skin in the game to contributors, particularly with startups, and create like a new kind of wealth. Like, I mean, everyone knows about how like tech companies and equity plays a big part of like game-changing financial gains. And so my co-founder Florent, who I actually met in business school here in France, he was the one that kind of turned me on to this concept very early on when he used work for equity to bootstrap his first startup. Tends to be effective when you have like no workforce, no money in the beginning, but you have a lot of confidence in your vision and your product, as well as an ability to bring other people into your vision and your product as well. So certainly a lot of traditional VC-backed ventures tend to hesitate with this because as you may well know, equity is kind of like gold for startups. Like it becomes more scarce as your venture grows, and it's what gets converted into value at the end of your journey, whether it's through IPO or exit. But I mean, the mindset we look at, and I think a lot of people in the Web3 and crypto space share this, is that 100% of zero really sucks compared to like 1% of something that's much more massive. And so, I mean, work for equity we saw was a great parallel in what was going on with ICOs and how people were doing bounties and airdrops. And our whole founding concept was, well, that's great, but it's not exactly legal. So how can we port a legal framework onto the tokens so that you can do this in a compliant way? Having said that, we really do think tokens, it doesn't necessarily have to be tokens, but digitization of equities, particularly private equity, is something that needs to and will happen in the near future. I mean, you see how much easier it is, particularly with transfers, with fractionalization in public shares. There's no reason why that can't be the case with private equity. It's just a matter of time as we realize it becomes more and more cumbersome, and just a big proportion of any kind of value is always shifted off to the service providers like lawyers, like accountants, to ensure that this process is well done. And in any case, this goes well in parallel with like, I don't know if you guys follow like Andreessen Horowitz at all, one of the big American VCs, Silicon Valley VCs. This goes in line with what's happening with things that they call the passion economy, that more and more people want to pursue jobs that are more in line with their personal values and their own vision and things like that. And it fits perfectly with the flexibility that tokenization can bring to things that are involved in like financial instruments. And then the last kind of vision we had was why we wanted to port securities on top of that is, for us, it was of the belief that normal people don't really care about crypto. And so how can you make a token something that your parents, your friends that aren't in this space care about? And our thesis again was that you could do it in the form of a security token where there's real asset backing the value of the token. Again, sort of the trends we were looking at was more and more people are pursuing work that they're legitimately interested in, that they have a passion for, as well as at the same time just accessibility to wealth is significantly decreasing. I mean, this isn't some kind of anti-capitalist tirade, but at the same time, more and more, I mean, the availability of like generationally changing wealth is less and less available. And so equity tended to be, historically has been that, but as I'll get into more later, as the road to IPO gets longer and longer, it's less and less accessible to people who aren't investors, who don't have kind of preferred shares in the ventures that are being built. They're working more on an employee basis, and they're not realizing the gains that are normally done through a traditional like what used to be like a 5-year roadmap to IPO. So this was our first platform actually, Quigley. Conceptually, I can lay it out for you. I mean, it's a React Redux app on the front. I mean, again, we're not hardcore decentralizationalists here. It's a security token. It's based on securities. To do an absolute decentralized tool for this is impossible. It's built on Postgres, but we leverage Ethereum in parallel with legally binding contracts to create a token that is a vehicle for the securities. This creates, I mean, the automation and execution workflows that you can build around this create a lot smoother of a completion, a fulfillment and transfer process, which brings a lot of liquidity, not necessarily from exits and exchanges, but at the least in terms of transfers. And we were building that on top of the ERC 1400 standard. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but for example, Consensus with their Codify initiative today, that's basically how they're building out their tokens. It's a standard that gives you a partial fungibility feature, which then can be used to replicate the excuse me, the transfer restrictions and the rules necessary to really emulate real-world securities. Excuse me. This is a further look onto the previous front end. As you can see, I mean, I think you can still check it out. It's equity.quid.ly. We made our entire employee cap table public. Basically, all the information is stored, is actually stored on blockchain. It's recalled onto the platform. All the documentation, all the historic distributions, everything is included for people to understand. Excuse me, why they own what they own, and it's displayed for you. In our work culture, at least in our company culture, transparency was another big reason for doing this. If you're working in exchange for value that's not yet realizable, at the least we can provide a way for everyone to understand where they stand in terms of what they've contributed and what they've earned. So my co-founder kind of doesn't like this graph because normally these kind of things are engineered in a way to show you why you're better than everyone else in this space. And as you can see, that's not necessarily the case in this graph. But this is, I guess, this is more and more the reason why, after spending almost 2 years working on this, why we're kind of transitioning away, why we're pausing away from security tokens at the moment. There are a lot of great initiatives out there today regarding how to port real securities to tokens. There are certainly bigger players than us, as I mentioned, like Polymath, which was something like a 50 mil ICO or something like that. Harbor, 30 mil traditional equity raise just on a concept pitch. But at the end of the day, most people literally just want liquidity out of what their earnings are. You can talk about skin in the game, you can talk about long-term future growth. Maybe that works for investors and founders and true believers, but at the same time, the majority, I mean, we had more than 30 contributors contribute to our early stages, and many of them, they're really not thinking about the long term, they're thinking about how can I get value now today? And as you can see, I mean, for us, it's plotted out simply as what's a full turnkey solution to ensure your emitted tokens are compliant, and how transferable and how valuable are those tokens made. And I mean, even the bigger players, Securitize, for example, has probably the best track record, and they've only really successfully tokenized 11 companies today. The biggest, or probably well known, is Blockchain Capital. And it's also ERC20 based. So if you check out EtherScan, you will see virtually no movement in any of these tokens. It's not realizing that kind of fully liquid vision that this space has kind of been built upon. I would say on our side, we tried to build Quigley as flexible as possible. We made it open so that you could apply any jurisdiction with your own legal contracts. We would handle the technical friction, but that in turn created a lot of confusion. What do I do with this? If I'm not a lawyer, how can I use this? And we weren't prepared to be a consulting or advisory service to teach people how to do this. And so I think fairly or unfairly, I place us kind of in the middle. But at the same time, I would say even the larger players like Securitize have not really realized that fuller vision today. Just kind of to dig into a little bit more about what I had mentioned. I mean, I think they sold this token in 2017 to a huge kind of reception. I think it was like 150 mil or something like this. Ripple was like the main purchaser of these tokens. And there's just no value. There's no movement. I think total volume since launching, 875, and most of that is just the emission. compare that to Bitcoin, for example, the total volume is a little over 400 mil. Maybe it's higher in 2020. ETH, 350 mil. And these are considered highly liquid in the crypto market. But if you compare that to, for example, Amazon on the public markets, Amazon gets traded more than 5 million times every day. So, I mean, this idea of liquidity, I think, is kind of the goal for a lot of these projects, and I think we're still a bit far from reaching that. That's not to say we don't appreciate this vision, and we still do think that it is the future of securities, but at the same time, the vision, I think, is a lot stronger than the feasible use cases that are available today. A good framework for us to look at it, I think, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. I would say security tokens, in our estimation, have entered the trough of disillusionment. Again, we do believe that this is a space that will rapidly grow once the initial barriers are passed. But today, I think since 2018, 2019, and now 2020 has successively been declared the year of the security token, the year of the STO. And if we're frank, if we're realistic about it, it still has not been super realized. Perhaps in other securities, like for example, real estate, we'll see some movement soon. But where we played, and I think where a lot of people do want to play in terms of ownership equity of businesses, there's still kind of a big gap to be fulfilled. So just to give you an idea of that, just to show you, I hope you can appreciate, we're not banging our heads on the same idea over and over and over. We've taken numerous approaches since we've launched. We initially started as programmable equity and really defined that as like a share per hour system. Kind of like how, I don't know if you guys are familiar with slicing pie or Hyperloop transportation technologies. We found that to be the most simple, basic, straightforward way to divvy up the value and extract value from building on top of blockchain, a kind of dynamic equity split where you're not forced into an arbitrary, like, oh, you and I are co-founders, let's do 50-50. And then, I mean, numerous problems can arise from that kind of corporate structure. And so we felt a share per hour system is something that really flexes the benefits of blockchain and would allow new ways of ventures of being built. We very quickly found a lack of product market fit in realizing most people don't want to do share per hour systems of building businesses. We then shifted very, very shortly off chain to be a legal template generator, but we were quickly outclassed by all the best tools out there like LegalZoom, like Clerky. We didn't have nearly enough legal expertise and breadth of options to replace some of the existing tools. We went back to programmable equity and tried to do just like more of a standard ESOP employee-based system because most of the leading platforms today are focused on investors. We certainly received, this is I think the one we've probably gotten the most traction with today. We had over 50 companies create their structures and make distributions, but frankly only 2 ever made them legal, and there weren't so many transfers that were ever happening after. We highly suspect we can't contact them anymore, but we highly suspect they just took the legal templates and are using them in a standard way without really using the token format. Having said that, we learned a lot from that and realized that a more expansive, more non-traditional way of sharing equity is something that people are more and more interested in. Let's say you're a contractor, let's say you're not a full-time employee, but you still want to share upside, you still want to give value to people you work with. It was something we were keying in more and more on, and one of the last plays we tried recently was a way to do that via phantom stocks or synthetics, and as well as revenue sharing using tokens. But I would say a caveat that I didn't mention before is we tried very hard to make a user experience that was accessible to non-Web3, non-crypto companies. And again, the addition of a token, the utilization of a token created too much friction for our early users for it to be a sustainable product. Perhaps we could be better developers or better entrepreneurs and find ways to do it, but trying to iterate quickly, trying to build quick and dirty products, we didn't find as much traction as we thought would be a sustainable way to grow this as a business. Again, the takeaways we take from this time are that the legal is a huge barrier to entry. Particularly, I think this is not meant to offend anybody or create any sort of bad will. Like, it's just, I think there are many, first-time founders in this space. There are many people who have never really thought about the business implications of building a venture before. And it's not an out-of-the-box tool, at least the way we built it. Again, maybe more talented entrepreneurs could have done it. But even, for example, the leading cap table management tool, Carta, it's not an out-of-the-box solution. And we quickly found that we were more consultants than software providers to a lot of our users. And that was not our core business. We're not HR consultants. We're certainly not lawyers, although we worked with many law firms to build out the workflows we have. And we didn't see a way to fully disrupt that space. I think at a certain point, blockchain and security tokens can really alleviate a lot of that pain, but it will take a lot of manual work on the beginning factors of that to create a truly successful product in a more automated regard. We also found that financials are also challenging for a lot of CEOs and founders to internalize. Even if they are experienced entrepreneurs, the only way to convince them to use a tool that's not incumbent or like a service provider, like a lawyer, is to really make it really address hair on fire problems. And the way we were approaching it were not really turnkey out of the box. Two that stand out significantly to us is valuation, which is fair. It's not just a token problem. It's for all early stage startups. Equity is, how do you value your business? Once you go through successive rounds of funding, you can base the valuation on how much you've taken in. For public companies, it's very easy. It's what the market declares what you are. But for a lot of small to mid-sized companies, not just startups, it's not something they're prepared to do. And then it becomes a kind of sensitive information to their employees. So we found that to be a challenge as well as the idea of like the dilution that occurs when you add more people into your cap table, when you were growing the pie. This is natural, but again, for many people, it's very hard to internalize, and that created a lot of friction, and it was not a very user-friendly experience for our early users to use as a long-term tool. So why do we stay in incentives and compensation today? If it sounds like I'm giving a very depressing emo conversation, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think as I stated, we are very much true believers in the security token, and our aim is to provide enough of our best practices and experiences to hopefully come up with a security token solution that can kind of address the sort of pain points that we do find and that have been validated, at least in our ability to at least to raise enough capital up to this date. It's something that can be done. It's just, and it's a space big enough for a lot of people to do it. So mainly this is a way to kind of share our learnings so far. And in any case, why do we do it? Well, I mean, employee engagement today is a huge problem. Companies spend over $200 billion a year trying to create a great retention stream for their employees. But it's just not sticky. I mean, more than 63% of employees today surveyed by human resources consultants say they don't care about the benefits of their firm. They're just there for a paycheck. And that simply wasn't the case before. I think for companies, they're looking for a way, again, to motivate that's competitive, simple, and cost-effective. And for workers, it needs to be meaningful and has liquidity. And so for us, I mean, tokens still represent a significant way to address that problem. And this is why we continue to work in this space. I mean, the solutions today are perks, which again, most employees don't care about. How many of you are actually using that gym membership that they renew every year for you? Do you care if there's like beer in the fridge or a hammock in the restroom? I mean, bonuses, cash are nice, but it's certainly not generational wealth building assets there. And as well as ESOPs and synthetic assets, they just simply they simply complicate the process for a lot of smaller companies. But for us, again, we really think skin in the game is a very strong incentive. I mean, Microsoft's IPO alone, the stats are always incredible to me. Like when they went public in '86, there were 4 billionaires that were minted immediately, and over the course of the next 15 years, 12,000 millionaires, and all of them have went on to become extremely involved in philanthropy. All of them have gone on to start many successful companies of their own. I don't know if you guys are familiar with FYIFV. It's why there was a very low churn rate during those years. It's what Microsoft employees used to tell each other. It's "fuck you, I'm vested," and it really shows you the power of what skin in the game can do for companies. You can see that innovation in this space is extremely effective. The best new companies of today, the companies of tomorrow, all highly leverage kind of innovation on ownership equity. Airbnb and Uber have been very publicly talking about how they can share more ownership with their hosts and drivers. Pinterest has shown a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can of the exercise times for options and equity. Who would imagine, without kind of holding over employees' heads of very short exercise opportunity periods, if you extend it from something short as 3 months to 10 years, your retention, their churn is 10%, which is significantly low for a Silicon Valley company. Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, as we mentioned, it's a company valued over $1 billion, and they all do it with paying most people in shares, no cash. All the money goes back into capital expenditures, things like that. So we're seeing a lot of the bigger companies of today becoming successful because of their levels of inclusion. And for us, it's a good indicator that there is innovation still to do in this space. However, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I mean, the nature of work is changing. The road to IPO has gotten longer, as you can see here. This used to be the case, coincidentally, a French company, Dassault. You were only raising private equity for max 4 or 5 years. And then you did the IPO, and that's how you grow the value of your company longer and larger. And the shares are immediately liquid for anyone at that time, and so there's really no risk of holding on to shares. But as you see more and more, the ironic thing is, as access to venture capital has gotten easier, companies are not going public as soon anymore. And so maybe for executives and investors, that's something that they can tolerate. But for employees that don't necessarily have the cash on hand to pay tax obligations, for example, on those assets, that creates a significant problem in terms of how do they realize the value, how do they get the gains out of something that they can't yet sell. There's numerous kind of platforms and services and strategies to try to build a secondaries market around these assets, but they're not quite there yet. And again, as I mentioned, things that you can do with smart contracts and blockchain can really alleviate a lot of these problems. And so this is why we think there is still room to play in security tokens, and it's not just like a dud space. Again, you can kind of see why IPOs are getting lower and lower too, with access to capital very fast and not very good reception of tech companies that are going public today. I mean, just drops in like some of the last big tech IPOs are kind of showing you why there's a lack of enthusiasm to go public for a lot of companies. And so this really impacts workers. Not to draw a direct correlation, but at the same time, employee churn, it's only one factor of many, but employee churn rates continue to rise. Duration, time spent at one company is decreasing more and more, and I think it shows that a level of inclusion that's not there that you saw during the enthusiasm of the early tech bubble years, like with for example, Microsoft. These kind of things are really impacting employee morale, and you're seeing more and more people. That's why it's an assumption of why the passion economy is growing more and more. If I'm not going to make money, at least I should not make money pursuing something I love. But from our findings, I mean, sharing value is more relevant than ever. I mean, we've talked to hundreds of companies and CEOs now. Only in my recollection, 2 have told us they don't want to share more value with their employees. Maybe that's a nice thing to say now with the zeitgeist of inclusivity, but as we noted with the more successful companies of today, just inclusivity and sustainability is more natural. It's an embedded thing with a lot of the younger generation, with a lot of the younger companies. And frankly, non-traditional work arrangements must be addressed. More and more people are working freelance. More and more people are working as a contract basis. They're working on several projects at the same time. The definition of work is changing, and so we need to think about how we can port compensation to apply to the realities of what's in the ground. Having said that, there are several challenges that we need to take care of, I think in terms of, not we necessarily, but that need to be taken care of to kind of create a more universal, a compliant universal compensation system. The immediate things that we don't control but are possible, I think are happening. There's increasingly more digitization of things like, for example, cap table management has digitized a lot for private equity, how you manage shares of ownership in businesses. And that's becoming more and more available, not just to large companies and tech companies, but small to medium-sized businesses, mom and pop shops. So that's happening. And as we showed with Quigley, as we showed with other platforms, the technical frictions can be addressed. This has never been a technical friction problem. And at the local levels, it varies, right? It's jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it's different. But for example, France is an example where recently with the Loi Pacte, they have given you kind of like an amnesty to use technology to manage your securities. Same with in the US with Delaware C Corps. They have stated that it is a valid way to manage your ownership structures. I think the bigger challenge is, can this be applied on a wider level, a more global level, particularly in this kind of audience and this kind of user segmentation? Is global regulatory cooperation possible? And I think that's where it's a legal friction, and I think that's where more of the question mark is, and that's why we've kind of decided to hit the pause button on taking a security token approach today. One of the things we're toying with today is crypto as a perk. For those of you here, I mean, have any of you ever been paid with crypto before? Okay, and do you prefer getting paid in fiat or like a traditional salary, or would you consider, who among you will only accept crypto? Wow. So I mean, it is one consideration we're taking. While valuation and skin in the game for unproven early stage companies or small companies is a tricky thing. Perhaps you can use volatile, new, exciting instruments like crypto to serve as a proxy in the meantime. We see it as good as entry point as a security token itself. Interestingly enough, you see the volatility. I mean, I chose to use Bitcoin, but you can apply it to ETH just as readily. And you see more and more younger people are willing to, at least, if not completely be remunerated, compensated in crypto, at least they want to own it in some form or fashion. So it's a potential option that we're looking at the moment. It's interesting to see how many of you are paid in crypto and are willing to be continued to be paid in crypto. And so yeah, this is kind of our journey from moving away from actual securities to more shared value kind of assets and agreements. It is, again, a very new kind of hot asset that young people are enthusiastic about. I don't know if that makes me sound old, but it is something, I mean, we're all here for this kind of thing. Increasingly more liquidity options, just not on exchanges, but through the various DeFi initiatives that have developed over the past year, past few months. And yeah, it's something that we're thinking about at the moment. So if anyone here is kind of interested in implementing that at their company or on their project, please come find me or talk to me afterwards, and I'd love to kind of chat more about building businesses, sharing value, creating smarter ways to distribute. It's our main vision and aim at Quigley. And regardless of what instrumentation is being used, financial or crypto, it's one that we'll continue to address. So thanks for your time. If you are interested in talking to me afterwards or finding me, here are my contact details. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Justin. That was an amazing talk. I would like to ask the audience if there's any questions you guys would like to Justin before he leaves. Lovely.
I hope it was interesting, relevant.
Do you think that in the future we're going to have more companies that are owned by communities and products that are going to be developed by the communities by itself, taking the approach of the DAOs? Sure.
DAOs are an extremely interesting animal. I'd like to say community-based organizations kind of already exist. Open source software, for example, is a huge example of that. I mean, for anyone familiar with open source software, I don't think you'd be surprised with sort of the controversies and argumentation that occurs in Ethereum development. It's just normal when you cram a bunch of people together with differing opinions and building ecosystems. But I do think, for example, that it shows that community-based businesses already can exist and thrive. Will there be more and more community-owned businesses? I think so. We'd like to say so. It'll take more time. I mean, the way we see it with companies that we talk to that do want to share equity with their communities. For example, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Boulevard, the open source mapping token app, DApp, that just recently shut down actually because he couldn't raise more funding. David was actually working with us to try to create a compliant equity token for his best drivers. And there's more and more companies that are willing to try to open up their cap tables a bit, but it wouldn't be majority community owned. He was still kind of slicing a pool of his complete cap table together to try to do that. So I think that is a more radical notion within the less radical framework of capitalism, but at the same time, I think that's a more realizable way of community ownership rather than majority. I don't know if you were meaning majority community owned, but it'll take time, right? As we know with all these things.
Do you have any examples that you can share of companies that are actually giving shares to their workers? And you mentioned Hyperloop. Yeah. Is there any more that we can look at?
Yeah, I guess we can chill ourselves a bit. We did it. We started that way. We completely bootstrapped until first hooking up with Consensus through their Tachyon accelerator. We worked with over 30 people, all dynamically earning shares in the business. At some points in the early days when we were all started, because we started from zero, it wasn't an arbitrary split. Some freelancers had more shares than me, and so that's kind of alarming. But at the same time, it was a very cool way to build a business when you had no immediate financial resources at your disposal. My co-founder Florent in the back, he built a virtual reality for in-flight entertainment startup using this concept. It went through Y Combinator afterwards. He would not have been able to build up those resources to get to that point without kind of community crowdsourcing those early stage developments. If you want more large-scale success stories, I think you see more and more companies engaging, if not at least in ownership, in phantom stock programs where it's cash, but it's based on top of valuation. Other companies that were looking, a lot of B Corps today. I don't know if you're familiar with corporations. It's not an actual entity or nomenclature. It's not an actual structure, but they're companies that their mission is to be more sustainable environmentally and socially. A lot of these companies are for-profit companies, but operate like co-ops. Eileen Braskin, I can get back to you later because I know who you are, but Eileen Braskin, the majority of her external shareholders are actually employees. And it's a huge New York fashion brand. And so more and more, with the development, with the unhappiness of how companies have kind of operated from like the 90s on, I think you're seeing more and more companies that are trying to open up their options pools and create more inclusive environments.
First of all, congratulations for the talk. And I really believe in your vision. And that's why, for instance, in giving classes about blockchain to lawyers, because when they understand the benefits of the smart contracts, everything, they feel more secure. There are no more barriers. And I think of the terms of the security tokens, all the situation is, the problem is the legal framework. The lack of a legal framework for that creates a barrier to the market, because for sure in business or financial terms, all those tokens, all your previous work might work, right? Might bring benefits for the investors. So I think one time in your presentation you mentioned that you are more nowadays like a consultancy company instead of a software company, and we have the same a similar a similar project in Brazil that 70% of our job is a legal job. It's not technical in terms of solidity, in terms of DApp, is done, everything works, but our work is in legal terms to not be, be regulated by SEC or the others kind of shit stuff. So again, congratulations, I really love it. And my question to you is, in terms of the employee, shares, so there's no SEC or FEMA or any other kind of regulation. So it's not under those tokens doesn't fall under those regulations.
Yeah, I mean, we took a normal, we're a normal Delaware C Corp. It's not to external investors, for example, so it doesn't fall under any kind of Reg A or Reg D framework. It's when we started, it's clear you have a deep knowledge, so I'm trying to unpackage it very audience friendly. There's multiple instruments for equity, right? And so when we started, we just gave normal plain vanilla preferred shares. As we realized that there are tax obligations involved, and the longer the road gets, it would be kind of painful for people who don't have longer term skin in the game. I don't know if you could see in the screenshot, but some of our contributor shareholders, they hold something like 0.01%, but to them that was significant enough. They loved the project enough to do it. So we moved on to us personally, and we offered it on the platform. We moved on to a framework using restricted stock units. It's kind of like how big tech companies in the US have enlarged their cap table without getting on the wrong side of SEC regulation. They're just basically coupons for stock offered, because you're capped at something like 2,000 shareholders normally. And Facebook was one of the bigger companies to use it in the beginning when they realized they were already capped with investors, but they still had a ton of employees that they owed kind of skin in the game to. So yeah, I mean, we created, we emulated restricted stock units. We had all the terms and conditions available that would keep you on the compliance side of that you weren't offering anything like penalizing to your employees. So all those workflows are built in, but unfortunately, or fortunately, they were only tied to U.S. companies. And this wasn't, for example, interestingly enough, we had a lot of interest from German companies. I guess we found out very quickly that there is a very rigid stock option system in Germany. Like even options for early stage companies can be taxed highly by the government. And so We had a lot of German founders looking for ways to kind of simplify that system. But as you mentioned, without a legal framework behind it, the tokens mean nothing. It's not like Bitcoin or Ethereum where we kind of communally come across the value, and as you see it on the exchanges, it's done by law and finance, and these are the kind of crossroads that fit with not just security tokens but equity in general. And it is a challenge. I agree with you. It's something that the easy thing would be to say, let's build a global standard, but that's not a very easy thing to do, right? So we were hoping that we could at least grow with a lot of some early stage companies, but unfortunately, most people were just using it like a normal cap table management tool. So for us, that told us it wasn't a huge hair on fire problem, and it would be something hopefully that we can return to as we continue to build out different value propositions using the core Quigley technology. Thanks for the question. I love people that we love and hate. We don't hate lawyers. Like we have a very love-hate relationship with lawyer. Exactly.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Give it up for Justin once again. And yep, thank you. Oh, that was amazing. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Appreciate it.
It's like not to talk to you. Potential.
I don't know if you're kind of like forced to listen.
No, but it's, I mean, that's what.
Awesome. I appreciate. What's your name?
Simon.
Simon.
It was a pleasure.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, for sure.
Enjoy. I'll see you around. Surely.